The dust settled on the horizon as Margaret Walsh pressed her face against the window of the stagecoach, watching the vast Texas prairie roll endlessly before her. At 13 years old, she should have been thinking about her lessons or the garden behind her family's Boston home. Instead, she clutched a letter that had upended her entire world. Her father, desperate and drowning in debt, had arranged her marriage to a rancher named Thomas Garrett, a man she'd never met, in exchange for money that would save their family from ruin. When the stagecoach finally stopped at Garrett's ranch, Margaret stepped down with trembling legs. The man who approached was weathered and tall, perhaps 40 years old, with kind eyes that seemed at odds with the transaction that had brought her here. He looked at her small frame, her tear-stained face, and something shifted in his expression. Margaret had rehearsed brave words during the long journey, but what came out was simply the truth, spoken with a child's desperate honesty. "I'm too young to be a wife," she said, her voice cracking. "Please, sir, I don't want this." Thomas Garrett stood silent for a long moment, the weight of her words hanging between them like a prayer. He'd expected a young bride, someone to help manage his sprawling property and fill the lonely evenings. He hadn't expected a child, frightened and small, who spoke the truth he'd been trying to ignore. In that moment, looking at Margaret's pleading eyes, Thomas saw his own daughter, lost to fever 3 years prior, and something fundamental broke and reformed inside him. "Then you won't be," he said simply, and Margaret felt her knees nearly give way with relief. Thomas took her trunk himself and led her not to the main house, but to a smaller cottage on the property. "This was my daughter Emma's place," he explained gently. "She loved her privacy and her books. I think you'll be comfortable here." Over the following days, Thomas made arrangements that shocked the small frontier community. He registered Margaret as his ward, not his wife. He hired a tutor from the nearest town and arranged for her to continue her education. When neighbors asked pointed questions, he met them with a steely gaze that discouraged further inquiry. But kindness, Margaret learned, could be complicated. Her father's creditors eventually tracked the money to Texas, and ugly rumors began to spread. Some whispered that Thomas had ulterior motives. Others suggested Margaret was running some kind of scheme. The local preacher arrived one afternoon, his face stern with judgment, demanding to know the nature of their arrangement. Thomas could have explained, could have defended himself, but he knew that Margaret's reputation mattered more than his own. "The girl is my ward, and that's all anyone needs to know," he stated firmly, and closed the door on further questions. For Margaret, watching this man absorb the community's suspicion to protect her innocence, something powerful stirred in her heart. It was gratitude, certainly, but also a dawning understanding of what true sacrifice looked like. Years passed like the changing seasons. Margaret studied literature and mathematics, learned to ride horses across the prairie, and helped Thomas manage the ranch's accounts with a sharp mind for numbers. She grew tall and capable, her childhood fear replaced by quiet confidence. Thomas never mentioned marriage, never suggested she owed him anything. He simply gave her space to become whoever she was meant to be. When Margaret turned 18, she made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She asked Thomas if the marriage arrangement her father had made could finally be honored, but on her own terms, with her own choice freely given. Thomas, shocked, initially refused. "You don't owe me anything," he insisted. "You never did?" "I know," Margaret replied, her voice steady and sure. "That's exactly why I'm asking. You gave me my childhood back when you could have taken it. You faced down this whole town's judgment to keep me safe. You taught me that family isn't about debts or obligations, but about choosing to stand by someone when you don't have to." "I'm not that frightened little girl anymore, Thomas. I'm a woman who knows her own mind, and I choose this. I choose you." The wedding was small and genuine, attended by the few neighbors who'd come to understand the truth over the years. As Margaret stood beside Thomas, she thought about the scared child who'd stepped off that stagecoach 5 years ago, certain her life was over. That girl had been right to protest, right to speak her truth. And Thomas had been right to listen. Sometimes the greatest act of love is waiting. Sometimes it's protecting someone's right to grow without obligation or expectation. In honoring her childhood plea, Thomas had given Margaret something rare and precious, the freedom to choose her own destiny. And in that freedom, She'd found something even more valuable, a partnership built not on debt or arrangement, but on mutual respect, gratitude, and genuine love that had grown in its own time, unhurried and true.